Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome for today's lecture on cyber mercenaries. Thank you all for being here. Sorry for the slight delay. We had like some technical issues, but we will start our lecture soon. Before I begin, just briefly like run through the organizational aspects. So as you know, we will have like 50 minutes for the presentation, and then you have 10 minutes for your Q&As. Please post your questions into the chat function, and then I will pick them up later. But please no spamming, so simply your questions. With that being said, today we're joined, or today's lecture will be held by Charlotte Lindsay, who has over 30 years of experience in humanitarian, cyber, and policy fields, including the impact and risk of emerging technologies. Lindsay is a former director of digitalization and data at the International Committee for the Red Cross and a chief public policy officer at the Cyber Peace Institute, where she has published and worked on digital transformation, cyber attacks, and cybersecurity. And with that being said, without further ado, Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm really pleased to be with you here today. So the lecture is around cyber mercenaries, a term that I really don't like because mercenaries are very much related to situations of conflict. But I will walk you through a little bit where have cyber mercenaries as a notion appeared from, what's the impact, and what are some of the challenges. So I'll go through this very quickly, but please do put any questions that you have. So cyber mercenaries is a term that's really developed over the last, I would say, probably decade, and it's really relates to individuals, companies, or groups who are conducting cyber operations. So espionage, cyber disruption, disinformation campaigns, surveillance on behalf of clients for payment rather than for a state interest or ideological reasons. And I think that that's what differs from the notion of traditional notion of mercenaries. Obviously, payment and is a clear aspect there, but then there are other dimensions which I will come on to later about where the notion of mercenaries differs in relation to conflict. So they're also not ordinary cyber criminals in that they carry out these sort of bespoke services to different governments, companies, or political actors. And they carry out, so there are terms that have become much more synonymous now in the cyber world. Those are things like espionage as a service, surveillance as a service, influence as a service, disinformation as a service, disruption as a service in the cyber field. What there are is very clear tactics and technologies that are being used in this domain. There are laws that apply and also non-binding instruments, and I'll walk you through those and what are some of the potential countermeasures. So I mentioned they can be formal or informal entities. So they offer these sort of cyber capabilities and services to really monitor, to try to capture or manipulate data. And a lot of cyber attacks are really about accessing data or causing disruption. And cyber mercenaries are a part of that ecosystem of cyber threat actors or malicious threat actors. So it's the use by external actors, so traditionally governments and other non-state actors, to carry out sort of malicious activities on their behalf. So it's evolved from this notion of state-sponsored hacking. So these units which are providing sort of cyber specialist skills. So it's really evolved in that domain with this sort of commercialization now, where you can buy in hacking as a service or access as a service. And it can be carried out by a range of different actors, from criminal networks to nation-state proxies, so those who are engaged on behalf of a state, as well as private cybersecurity actors. Some of the typical techniques involved and tactics are around espionage, so hacking into a government or corporate entities, disinformation campaigns, so influence campaigns, and there has been a real rise of this in recent years. Those who are really trying to influence the political or economic landscape, and carrying out these influence campaigns. And there has been definitely a merger between criminal actors and disinformation actors in recent years. But also the notion of ransomware and financial extortion, or selling zero-day exploits and malware development. So malware, so malicious bugs and viruses, or spyware tools. The most famous being, Pegasus, which was recognized over 10 years ago as introduction of malicious technology onto smartphones and also computers, which is able to survey, which is able to capture in real time what is happening, what the individual is doing on that device, and monitor their activities. Also seeing more AI enhanced hacking, and that often comes from the ability to really understand more about an individual, to entrap them to upload spyware, or to really be able to develop content that they will much more easily believe, and also able to do that on scale. And then dark web marketplaces for these services. So you go onto the dark web and you're able to contract for these services there. It's deployed in situations of conflict, in corporate espionage, in political interference, surveillance of individuals, often human rights workers, opposition leaders, individuals that are seen as in opposition to the current political actors, and then against critical infrastructure because of the disruption that it can cause. So just to recap, there's this market for offensive cyber tools and services. They do undermine peace, security, and stability. They create harms, and a broad range of harms which are coming out because people are either psychologically affected, or it impacts their physical security because they're being monitored, as well as obviously financial and political harms, and harms to peace and security. It targets infrastructure, organizations, and individuals, and it leverages technology which has legitimate uses for illegitimate purposes. And I think that's the real problem. It's technology which is existing. So surveillance technology has been developed primarily for to monitor those who are perceived to have broken the law. But in this case, the technology is actually being used. So legitimate technology, which is being developed for specific purposes, is being misused and for illegitimate reasons, which may be considered unlawful. And it leverages, obviously, the market for vulnerabilities. So malware, zero-day exploits. It becomes a whole market behind this to try to identify ways to infiltrate this technology into the devices of those who are who are being put under surveillance. So this is where it differs from traditional mercenaries. So mercenaries are referenced in certain legal frameworks. These are the ones that are, for example, Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions are the laws of war. So the rules that apply in situations of conflict, of international and non-international armed conflict. So there is a reference in Additional Protocol 1 to traditional mercenaries. There's also reference to them in the International Convention against the recruitment, use, financing, and training of mercenaries, as well as the Organization of African Unity Convention for the elimination of mercenarism in Africa, to give some examples of legal frameworks. Other legal frameworks that would also apply would obviously be aspects linked to breaches of international human rights law. So what are the criteria that are used in those legal frameworks to define mercenaries? So they are specifically recruited locally or abroad to fight in an armed conflict. So that was the traditional means, whereas today a lot of the use of surveillance technology is being used in situations which would not amount to an armed conflict. A mercenary also had to be taking a direct part in hostilities. So again, mercenaries today may not be taking, so cyber mercenaries may not be taking an active part in hostilities. So something which has reached the threshold of conflict. They're motivated by financial gain, by a party to a conflict, or compensation which exceeds that of a normal combatant. So that it could be, that could apply because obviously it's generally for financial gain. They're not a national of a party, so they don't come from the territory under which they're contracted as mercenaries. So they're not resident or of origin of that. That differs from cyber mercenaries today outside situations of conflict because they may come from the territory. They're not a member of the armed forces of a party to the conflict, and they're not sent by a state which is not a party to the conflict. So a party to the armed conflict under international law, they would not be considered as one of those parties to a conflict, i.e. they're not otherwise involved in hostilities. So in addition to what I mentioned before around those three legal frameworks, there are laws and norms on ICTs. So the UN Charter is obviously an important place to look for aspects that would regulate the use of mercenaries. So the UN Charter is really the baseline for where you would look at discussing the use of malicious ICTs. Even though obviously that predates the use of ICTs, but the UN Charter would look at sovereignty. Has there been a breach of sovereignty of a state? Is the state using, are there other peaceful means to settle a dispute between countries? The UN Charter also prohibits the use or threatened use of force against the territorial integrity of a country. So a cyber operation could amount to that if it's similar to an armed attack. And so that's something to bear in mind. And aspects linked to self-defense. Obviously, countries have an inherent right of self-defense if an armed conflict occurs. So those are some aspects of the UN Charter. International humanitarian law mentioned, that's the laws of war. And there are obviously clear prohibitions and aspects linked to the protection of those who are not taking part in hostilities, so civilians or prisoners or the sick and wounded. So there are obligations under international humanitarian law which would have to be respected even in the use of cyber. International human rights law, so things like freedom of expression and the right to privacy. So those are aspects where the use of cyber mercenaries may breach the international human rights law. There is also 2 UN forums which have functioned over the last 2-3 decades. The first is the United Nations Global a group of governmental experts, and the second is the UN's open-ended working group on the responsible use of ICTs. And they have developed norms of responsible behavior. And these also are clearly, although they're voluntary, are a dimension which you can look at in relation to what would be considered inherently wrongful acts. And so, not to use proxies to carry out something intentionally wrongful using ICTs, responsible reporting of any vulnerabilities in technology. So those are dimensions that the open-ended working group has looked at. It shouldn't be carrying out an attack on another country. So those are dimensions that are not to misuse ICTs, and those are covered under voluntary normative framework carried out under the UN's group of governmental experts, which is now framed around 2 open-ended working groups, which carry on until the end of this year, which have been exploring also how states perceive cyber in relation to how our international law applies to the use of cyber. And so that's normative development and that normative understanding of what states perceive as responsible behavior, that work is continuing. There is also another framework which has been developed, which is the Cybercrime Convention, which was developed and adopted under the United Nations. That's another aspect which can be looked at is this considered as a cybercrime? There are also other non-binding instruments. So the Wassenaar arrangement, which is particularly around exporting technology. The European Parliament's PEGA committee, which was which developed and did an investigation into the use of Pegasus and other spyware technology in Europe, which concluded 2 years ago. There's also been the UN Working Group on the Use of Mercenaries, the Tallinn Manual, as well as the Pall-Mall process, which was developed by the UK and French governments in 2024, which was looking at whether there were guardrails or principles that could be put in place for the appropriate use of mercenary, cyber mercenary technology, or particularly spyware and other intrusive surveillance technology, and whether guide rails could be put in place. And that was a process being led by those two governments. Other relevant principles are the Montreux document, which is a document developed by the Swiss government and the International Committee of the Red Cross, which was looking at also particularly responsible behavior. There's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. There's the Cybersecurity Tech Accord developed by tech companies. There's the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, and other relevant normative frameworks which have been developed to try to ensure peace and the appropriate use of technology in cyberspace. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression did call in 2019 for a moratorium on the sale, transfer, and use of surveillance tools. And many civil society, human rights organizations, from Human Rights Watch to Access Now and others, have called to say there should be a halt on the sale, transfer, and use of these tools until there are appropriate safeguards in place. Some say there would never be appropriate safeguards that could be developed, but at least there should be a halt to the sales, transfer, and use until such frameworks are put in place. What are some of the countermeasures? Obviously, you can blacklist violators, ban cyber mercenary firms from using certain platforms. You can prevent purchases by non-state actors. There are various oversight mechanisms and cybersecurity measures that can be put in place. But really, it is important to understand this sort of cyber mercenary market. I think there are some key issues. Obviously, cyber mercenaries, if they are acting in wartime, they wouldn't have combatant status, so they may lose their civilian status and be considered as directly participating in hostilities. Also, there are this is technology with acceptable uses, which I mean at the beginning. And so it's very hard when you've got a technology which has acceptable uses to constrain its use. But clearly legal restrictions need to be in place. There is this ambiguity about legal status in cyberspace. Many states believe that international law applies in cyberspace. The question is how it applies. One of the aspects is also attributing responsibility to a cyber attacker and its client, and that means identifying under which legal framework and who is actually responsible for the illegitimate use of the malicious use. And then obviously cyber proxies can move across borders, and that makes a challenge for accountability because states have to agree on holding somebody to account. It undermines trust in cyberspace and technology. So I'll stop there. That was a very, very quick overview of the whole cyber landscape, particularly from the perspective of mercenaries. I'll stop sharing so that I can then see where there are questions. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks so much for your presentation. And yeah, just we have a look at whether we have any questions. 1 second. I think one of the participants, oh no, raised their hand. I don't know if it's still relevant. Apparently, no. But I received a different question from. Oh, the hand is still on. Maybe I will. The participants that are raising their hands, can you just please put your questions into the queue and the chat function, please? Whilst we're waiting for that, I think you mentioned that it is possible to sort of ban or prohibit the sale of certain software. To what extent is that feasible in practice? Because I guess like that there, states have like various motivations for doing that, access to resources, but also then, to, shift deniability or like responsibility to other actors. So to what extent is that actually possible?
Yeah, I think that's the challenge of when a technology has a legitimate use, and many states believe that the use of surveillance technology is important in relation to criminal activity and in relation to national security. Those are the reasons for which it's generally sold, and it would be sold to states. The problem is that obviously this is being misused, and it's very complex to firstly identify this misuse and then work out who and attribute it to a particular actor. I think that's where the European Union's PEGA committee, which was looking particularly at Pegasus and other surveillance technology over a number of years, was really trying to understand the extent of the harms and who was being impacted by this. And, they did identify human rights workers, journalists, opposition leaders who have a legitimate function in society, but that were subject to surveillance technology. And so there have now been legal cases that have been brought in countries like France against the use of this technology. And that's really the ways forward, is to bring the evidence to be able to bring cases and to hold perpetrators to account. That's really the way forward. It's complex to build a case. And it also, obviously, if the perpetrators, those who have carried out a breach, are not in the same country, then it's also difficult to bring them to account. You need to then be able to have cooperation between different states in order to bring them to account. We're not in a phase of history when there's a lot of cooperation between states to hold actors accountable for cyber, sadly. I see Chandrasekhar's hand is up. Did you want to take the floor? I think he put a question in the chat, or actually asked, could you have access to the legal frameworks based on the slides? I don't know what reference readings. I mean, I can provide a list of reference readings if you want further to this call. Happy to do so.
One other question that we received is about regarding more attribution. I don't know whether you can answer this. And it has been said that if a country faces an attack by a cyber mercenary, how can it really legitimately defend itself against this sort of attack? I don't know whether you can provide like some some cases or like insight on that.
Yeah. So attribution is something that's really complex. I don't know if you have a session on that, but in attribution, there's generally three key ways to attribute an attack. And that would be a technical attribution. So that would be where the technical fingerprint behind the techniques, the tactics, procedures that were used, and also the type of attack that was carried out. You can carry out a technical assessment to determine who was the attacker and then try to attribute that technically. The second dimension is a legal aspect. So you go to a court and you determine a legal attribution of the attack based on those technical tactics, procedures. And then the third is is a political attribution. So a political attribution would be generally a state stating that this attacker has carried out. A good example of a political attribution was when the UK government made a political attribution which stated that the WannaCry attack, which was a virus which affected the National Health Service and a number of other services in the UK, they attributed that to actors inside North Korea. So they didn't say North Korea, they said actors inside. So countries are very, very careful about attributing an attack because of the implications that is about state responsibility. And also because it can identify that they have the means to determine who carried out an attack. There is a fourth dimension of attribution, which has come in recent years, and that's of self-attribution, where a cyber threat actor is saying, we carried out this attack. And they've seen a proliferation of these self-attributed attacks since the war between Ukraine and Russia over the last, since 2022, where a number of actors have come out saying, we are responsible for this act, which has been very rare. Up until then, because of those aspects that I mentioned. This is a wartime situation, obviously, but so attribution is a complex dimension. You have to take a lot of care in attribution because of the implications of doing that. And so actors are very careful about attributing because they do not want to, because of the implications of this under law, and also the implications to respond. And that's why also the UN Charter is important to recognize, because any acts that have been taken out, which would be considered as an act of force or an attack, an act of aggression, there are responsibilities on states to try to settle disputes peacefully. And so, that's why that body of law, or the UN Charter, is really important, as well as other bodies of law. I see a question.
Okay.
Could cyber mercenary work ever be considered legal under certain situations like government contracts? I mean, yes. I think that the trouble, the issue is identifying which body of law is responsible for that. Yes, actors would hire other actors to carry out acts for them. It's very, very difficult to make that link between them, but certain states would say that the work that they have contracted under certain conditions would be considered as legal. Most of the examples that are currently known are really where an act is considered to be a breach of somebody's international human rights, or a breach of international law. So the use of Pegasus surveillance technology on the phone or on devices of a human rights worker was perceived to be a breach of their human rights, whereas the actor that carried out that surveillance perceived that it was potentially a lawful act. So this is where there's this sort of blurred boundaries between what is carried out and not. Some actors will say, it's not us. We didn't commission that as a state. We didn't commission a breach of somebody's, the surveillance technology being placed on somebody's telephone. And that is really, really hard to make that link and say, attribute that to an actor, because there are many lines of proxies and other actors in between the victim and those who have commissioned it. And so that's why the UN and others have called, for example, on a moratorium on the sale of this surveillance technology until there are strong guardrails in place which would determine that, including therefore also on the ability to export. Who would you be able to sell and export or transfer that technology to? And that's why that call by the UN Special Rapporteur on the moratorium on the sale was really important, to be able to say, let's make sure we understand what would be the legal framework under which that sort of technology would be sold. Are there international cyber laws or such management? Sadly, no one organization. There obviously are a number of organizations which look at this. So the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, if anything that would be breach of somebody's human rights, for example, freedom of expression, right to privacy, right to life, anything that might be threatening somebody's human rights. Under international humanitarian law, the International Committee of the Red Cross is the guardian of international humanitarian law. So if cyber is being used in relation to an armed conflict, that would be the organization. It wouldn't generally publicly state, but it would engage directly with parties to conflict. There is many other organizations that are looking at this from different perspectives. So transparency, right to privacy, and NGOs, human rights organizations that look at this, that do raise concerns, and that do support cases that are being brought, providing evidence and support. So Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and others that are actively engaging to try to bring evidence of the misuse of this technology and the harms that it creates to individuals, and have brought cases and supported the work that is being done by those governments who are trying to put in place guardrails, or also to bring cases or support cases that would be being brought legally. There isn't one organization. And then you have the open-ended working group that looked at cybercrime, and those that are looking at the responsible use of ICTs, which are the normative framework. And then there's the Cybercrime Convention, but there's not one organization that looks at this specifically. But yes, as you're right, people can do cybercrime from anywhere in the world. There are the normative framework is the sort of the responsible use of ICTs is the one that's trying to voluntarily bring states together to accept what are the norms that should be applied to in cyberspace. But as they're voluntary and difficult to monitor their application, it makes it very complicated.
Okay, then we have like two questions in the Q&A chats. There's the question of whether they are cyber mercenaries that have been tried in a court of law.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first one, and then the other one, I don't know whether you want to respond immediately or like afterwards, but it has been said that cyber attribution is difficult. Oh no, that one was already stated. So just on whether, yeah, if there are examples that cyber mercenaries have been tried in court actually.
Yeah, so I mean, what would come under cyber mercenaries is this use of surveillance. So yes, for example, in France against human rights work organizations. So this was the what's called the NSO group, which was behind Pegasus. So WhatsApp, so Facebook Meta brought cases to the US court. So the NSO group, so this group that brought Pegasus, was also put on a blacklist by the US Department of Commerce in 2021. There are civil suits that are ongoing from journalists and other activists who were specifically targeted. So some of the work that was done by human rights organizations were able to produce on the basis of being able to identify the telephone numbers of those individuals that were targeted, were able to then identify who the names of journalists and human rights workers and opposition workers and opposition leaders that were targeted. And there are some lawsuits that have been brought by those individuals. And so I think there have been a few cases. So in France, for example, there were some cases, but very few. And mostly it would be brought, under things like espionage but I think the tech companies have certainly tried to bring cases against the companies that have used exploits to gain access to their technology, which is obviously in breach of any of the rules. And that's why the tech sector was very strong in bringing the Cyber Tech Accords forward, which was about responsible use of technology, because they obviously rely on the trust of the users have of the security of their technology. So they have been quite forward in trying to bring cases when it's possible to identify who the perpetrators are.
Okay, thank you for that. And then another user question is asking whether more cyber operations that target the mind, so I guess like more like information operations that then can lead to emotional concerns, or like causes even physical harm, whether they are or whether the the legal framework applies to them as well, like whether they are treated in any way by the legal framework.
Yeah, so I think one of the really, really important dimensions of understanding the impact and harms of cyber threats, whether it's mercenaries or other cyber threats, is really to identify what is the harm. I did some work in the Cyber Peace Institute when I was there to develop a methodology to measure, qualify, and quantify the harms of different cyber attacks, including surveillance technology. And I think it's really important because there's a lot of noise which says that cyber attacks, it's technology against technology, or it's about data. There aren't really, the impacts and harms are more financial or to the technology. That's not the case. Cyber attacks really do have physical, psychological impacts, intergenerational impacts. They have a range of different harms which need to be understood and monitored and measured, because if you can measure then you can monitor and measure those different harms, then you can also bring the full range of responses that are necessary to support people that have been victim of this. Some aspects have been around physical harm. There are some that say there are very few cases where cyber has created a physical harm, so cyber on. There are others that would look at, for example, a breach not by cyber mercenaries, but by cyber threat actors in Finland. There's a very famous example there where cyber attackers, they happen to be nationals of the country, but they breached a psychosocial center where which was covering a huge part of the country, and they breached the data of that company, and then they both tried to demand ransom from the company to get access to that data and not leak it, but then also to individuals that were the victim, whose data was there. So there was this double extortion going on, and there were a lot of harms that were clearly to somebody who was already psychologically vulnerable, that had already gone to receive psychosocial support, to then have their data not only published but also then receive an extortion request to not upload it or to take that data down. And there were cases that were brought against those individuals in Finland to hold them to account for the case, for the malicious use of cyber there. And it was a national case. They were national. So there has been a recognition there of the harms that were caused. This was, in this case, not done as a cyber mercenary. But yeah, I think there's more and more. I think the most famous clearly is Pegasus, or the surveillance for hire, where the human rights organizations did try to really identify harm. So you had a range of organizations that were really interviewing the victims of the use of this surveillance technology, that were trying to identify the specific harms to somebody's sense of security, somebody's peace of mind, somebody's physical security, and reliance on, and that was then used to try to frame the necessary safeguards that needed to be put in place. So yes, work is being done primarily by human rights workers that are trying to support them. Do organizations hire cyber mercenaries to test their own systems? I would say they're called ethical hackers. I wouldn't say they're not cyber mercenaries. They're generally called ethical hackers or white hat hackers, which are hired to do penetration testing to see where the vulnerabilities are. And that's known by a company that's recognized part of the cybersecurity resilience model of many organizations who would put in place their cybersecurity procedures, protocols, and technologies, and then look to identify an ethical hacker or white hat to be able to look to see where the vulnerabilities are. And there's an industry around that too. Any reference books to read on cyber mercenaries? Yes, a man called Tim Maurer, who's an American, has written a book called Cyber Mercenaries, which dates now from, I think, the early, maybe it's 5 or 6 years old, but it's very good. And I believe Tim Maurer, and he then worked for the White House. He now works for Microsoft. So he's written a sort of a definitive book on cyber mercenaries. There is also a small publication which came out of a working group that I was chairing for a number of years, which is also linked to understanding the surveillance market and cyber mercenaries, and Tim was on that working group. So there's a number of small publications. I'm very happy to send the links to to HDSS so that they can access those. And then how do cyber mercenaries differ from traditional hackers or hacktivists? So I would say the dimension is this payment by a third part, a state or group to carry out an attack on another state or group. I think generally hacktivists are linked to, so the term comes from both activist and hacking. And so there is generally more of an ideological aspect to this rather than financial. So you saw a lot of hacktivist groups that are operating in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, where they're there fighting for the national security, or some may be linked to a state or proxy to a state, or working to support their national security dimensions. And they probably wouldn't be considered as cyber mercenaries by their state because they come from within the state. You may have a group that's working completely independent of that, that might be working in a third country, which is actively engaged. That might be for political means, that may be considered a cyber mercenary. So it's a very, very difficult line. That's why I don't really like the term cyber mercenary. I prefer the term sort of surveillance for hire, or there's disruption for hire, than I do cyber mercenary. And I think the term is used because it's more evocative rather than legally necessarily always correct. What role does the dark web play in supporting cyber mercenary operations, and can you give some real world snippets where cyber mercenaries were hired? So the dark web, obviously, it's difficult to know. I mean, Telegram is also one of the channels that is used. Yes, the dark web, for that very reason, is very difficult to. It's a place where you can access those sorts of services, but there are many companies that would be considered by some as cyber, or providing tools for these activities, which are companies which are operating on the market. So they're companies which have this technology. So I think that yes, any means where people can be in contact with those who are wanting malicious services, and the dark web is one of them. I think, yeah, the most famous examples of cyber mercenaries I've given are more Pegasus. It's the one that's the most known, and those sort of surveillance for hire companies whose technology was used for malicious activities. So I think that's the most famous example of this. Yes, that's Tim Maurer's book, The State Hackers and Power. And I think you'll see in his book, he talks a lot about how this cyber notion of cyber mercenaries also emerged in relation to being able to respond where a country didn't have the capabilities in cyber to really respond. And this happened in the sort of 2014s onwards, when cyber became used by states much more offensively, and therefore those who had capabilities developed into groups that could support the state or could act on behalf of the state, and that comes out there.
Okay, I have a question from another user, and he points more to the transnational aspects of cyber mercenaries, I think, and he sort of brought the example, for example, that we have a Zoom call, or maybe like even this meeting, and then someone is trying to hack it from abroad. And I think that the question pertains to whether the law, like whether there are means to to address these transnational crimes. So is it somehow possible to pursue like an individual that is like hosted in a different country, and probably also the question relates to the fact whether there's like a certain legal basis that covers most or all countries that would actually make it possible to prosecute these crimes.
So the Cybercrime Convention, which came in last year, was aiming to really build on a convention which is called the Budapest Convention, which by its nature was seen originally as European, but then many other countries joined that Budapest Convention. And the UN Convention was brought in last year after many, many years of negotiation to really try to put a halt to cyber crimes that were being committed, but also to look at what was the response needed between states in order to be able to handle this. And that requires really cooperation between states to first, identify the origin of the attacker, and then be able to pursue them legally to be able to carry out an investigation. If those are operating outside a country, that's then much more difficult. It requires this sort of cooperation. And so you do have groups that are where there's collaboration and treaties between different countries or agreements between countries that they would cooperate to bring malicious actors to account. You saw some of this at the beginning or in sort of 2021 when then US President Biden and the Russian President Putin came to Geneva, actually here in Switzerland, where they held meetings where they were discussing where cybercrime was on the agenda, and particularly cybercrime that was being carried out that was attacking critical infrastructure. And there you did see some tentative areas of cooperation where it was shown that certain actors, so part of threat actor groups, were arrested. And then you had the 2022 escalation of hostilities between Ukraine and Russia with the full-scale military invasion, and that sort of put an end to that type of cooperation. So, and you haven't heard anything more on this. You haven't heard of the disruption of threat actors. I think what you do see now is some countries who are trying to disrupt the threat actors themselves by what they call defending forward. And so there's that type of disruption. But certainly the attempt with the Cybercrime Convention is to frame what acts are really criminalized, and how to do things like cross-border evidence sharing and cooperation. So I think that, that's clearly an area. I think it took 5 or 6 years to bring this convention forward. So you know how long that takes. And I think there was concerns about the very broad scope of the notions of what was considered by that treaty. And whether it was a real complement to the Budapest Convention and what this meant. I would say some of the challenges are that cybercrime is borderless, so it's very difficult to manage this. Evidence is also digital, so that be able to collect that evidence, maintain that evidence, and to be able to leverage that is complex. And the cybercrime industry is a very strong industry with strong links also to organized crime. It's very difficult to disrupt, especially if there isn't really agreement between states on doing it. So, and it's generally not between like-minded countries that these attacks are happening. How can we youngsters, or in what roles we can step into these cyber works or mercenaries? Not sure I understand the question. Are you trying to get in to become one, or are you trying to avoid being a victim of one? I'm not sure. How can we youngsters, or in what roles we can step into these cyber works and mercenaries? Yeah, not sure. I'm not going to give any hints about how to become a cyber mercenary.
Whilst maybe the user clarifies his question a bit more, related to what you said before, do you know whether states or even companies are maybe reacting more aggressive towards perceived cyber mercenaries, because they there's like this perception maybe that they are not affiliated to a government, and therefore there's less inhibition to counter their activities also with offensive means? Or is it more for a tit for tat strategy, or is that something that is not really observable in the real world?
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a really important point between what's defense and what's offense. And if it was a situation of armed conflict, for example, if you carry out a defensive action or if you carry out an offensive action, you're still participating in a conflict, so you could be considered as a party to the conflict. I think so. Defense and offense, you have to be really careful in that regard. I would say most companies, most organizations are involved in defense, trying to secure their the perimeters of their organization from a cyber perspective to minimize the risk of or the occurrence of a cyber attack. The sort of tech platforms, the companies that are involved in also trying to protect their services and their clients, they also are much more involved. They have to be much more involved in defensive, because offensive could be perceived maybe breaching international laws or their national laws. So it's a very fine line. So companies don't actually have many measures other than legal or to ask the state to intervene. So for example, with critical infrastructure, you see that there may be in the hands of private companies or maybe with governments. They are trying to put the norms around and say, do not attack critical infrastructure. That is a norm that we should all agree on, because the population depends on that for health, survival, etc. It might diminish for a while, the attacks, but then you see them increase again. And I think offensive you have to be really careful about, because you could be in breach of national or international laws. And so I think that offensive is a very fine line. There are some governments, so for example, the US government has had a policy for a number of years, which is called Defend Forward, which it says is about disrupting the disruptors. So, but there are some that may consider that as offensive and not defensive. So I think there's a really, really fine line here. The primary focus is on defense, is about defending at an organizational level and an individual level, people's cyber security, and then reliant on the state and diplomacy, bilateral negotiations to try to put an end to cyber crime, or cyber attacks, which are happening cross-border.
Right. Thank you for that. And then one user asked whether even cyber mercenary organizations have a code of conduct. So probably also speaking to the organizational aspects, if there's like some sort of professionalization of these mercenaries, and whether it would be good to have a international registry on cyber mercenary entities. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the organizations do publish the names of different threat actors, may not always be considered cyber threat mercenaries, but at least cyber threat actors. So I think there is a recognition of that. In terms of professionalism, yes, they are companies, and those. So some of the organizations which have been had a breach themselves have had their HR codes, for example, put online. So they have an HR code. So they run also like a business. So some of them are very professional. I'm not so sure there's a code of conduct because certainly what is seen is if they're organizations that are, for example, not-for-profit organizations that have been attacked, have had difficult line to decide, is it a mercenary attack or not, have targeted human rights workers or have targeted organizations that are not for profit. And it might be that those organizations have been able to request a decrease in the ransom, but they haven't necessarily been able to prevent an attack because they're NGOs, and actually they're often seen as more vulnerable. So and more of a soft target. So the organization I previously worked for, the Cyber Peace Institute, which does a lot of work around cybersecurity of the not-for-profit sector, there they often found that organizations were deliberately being targeted because they were seen as low risk if you targeted them. So I don't think that there's a particular code of conduct. It's seen as business, and I think they're often very professional and really run as a business entity.
And another user asked whether, or he points out that probably in a cyber attack there are multiple people involved, and he cites the case of the Israeli pager attack, and therefore he asked whether the people that are part in the attack, like conducting it, planning it probably, whether they could be considered to be cyber mercenaries. So he sort of relates this question to the overall chain that is needed to execute such an attack, and whether, probably all of them that have like some sort of stage in the attack can be called cyber mercenaries.
I think that the determination of that would be carried out by the state for where the action has taken place. I think in the example of the Israeli pager attack, I mean, it was a physical device which was probably detonated by something cyber, but the actual attack was on physical pager of something that had been placed inside the pager, as I recall. So explosives that had been paged. So it wasn't necessarily what would be considered a typical cyber type attack, because it was a physical device which may have been detonated through some sort of trigger mechanism, which was cyber. So I'm not sure that's a classic example of a cyber threat, a cyber attack. And again, it's attribution. Determining that at a level that would reach a legal determination is also something that would have to take place through the courts. So I think that's not. I wouldn't say that would be a classic example of a mercenary attack.
Okay, and maybe one last question. Are certain states more likely to make use of cyber mercenaries? So is it like more of a capability? Does it have more like a capability approach or like background? So meaning that some states would like to carry out certain acts, but then lack capabilities and therefore make recourse to cyber mercenaries, basically to outsource it? Or is it like more really, do we see like some correlation between, perceived capabilities and then the use of cyber mercenaries by states?
So I mentioned very, very briefly the Montreux document, which was developed by the Swiss and the International Committee of the Red Cross 2 decades ago, because that was an attempt pre-cyber to really look to deal with the cases of the outsourcing by governments to private military and security companies, where a lot of states were then sending these private military and security companies to act as to carry out, defending the military bases where their forces were placed, or for prison work. And so these principles, the Montreux document and the principles therein, were developed to say, hey, even if you are hiring a private military and security company, so again, pre-cyber, but even if you're hiring them, there are principles and there are responsibilities that go with that. And I think the same has been applied. That's why it's a relevant framework also to look at now in an age of cyber, because the same approach needs to be applied. If a state is using recourse to a third-party actor to carry out activities in place of the state, then there are obligations and rules that would apply. And so I think that there are relevant analogies there, and that's why the Montreux document has sort of been resurrected a little bit more for the cyber age, and saying, hey, this is a relevant framework to learn from, because we've seen this type of action of outsourcing of activities to a third party before on behalf of the state. And so I think that that's an interesting analogy, and I think there it's possibly a capability approach, but I think also it might be by some actors a distancing, so a proxy, so there's less ability to attribute directly to the state. And in other cases, it could be, and I think Tim Maurer refers to this in his book, groups that were not necessarily under the control of the state when they set up, but they're useful for the state. In that it's carrying out activities that are supporting the national, in that case, the war effort, and they didn't necessarily control them. It's not something they necessarily thought of in 2014, but then it became a very useful resource. And if you look at what the Ukrainian government did in 2022, when it called for a cyber army, was actually then to look at anybody who had those cyber capabilities could support. Russia then did the same. And then there was a big question about, well, under whose authority and responsibility are they? And what does that mean legally? So I think there's all of those aspects are important to take into considering: capabilities, control aspects, outsourcing, and building up capabilities and building up the strength, the bandwidth of an actor.
I think maybe the last question for today, which I need to admit I need to a bit delve into that because I have some troubles to understand it correctly. But the question is, in which areas would cyber mercenaries be most deployed? So, yeah, probably the question relates to whether or countries that have probably like a higher GDP, I don't know, would be more likely to make use of them. Maybe I don't know
yeah. I think what is really, really complex about this surveillance industry is just how opaque it is. There's a supply and there's a demand, but where the supply is, there's a lot of shell companies behind them. It's very, very difficult. You kind of have to treat it a bit like the financial crime sector is follow the money, try to work out, but that's incredibly complex endeavor to work out where these surveillance companies are based, who they work for, and how, because of the opaqueness of this industry. And that's why I prefer the notion of surveillance for hire rather than cyber mercenary, because then you start to be able to trace what the problem is you're dealing with. And I think that's the big challenge, identifying who's hiring them, where these companies are based, what's the structure, the structure behind them, and where are they operating. And I think that's a huge piece of work that still needs to be carried out.
Okay. I think in light also of our time, I think I would slowly conclude our lecture today. Lindsay, thank you very much for your time, for giving us some insight into, or like an introduction into cyber mercenaries. I think it was very insightful and also very crucial, like in today's world when we have like a lot of conflicts and also our more and more interconnected world. So thank you for your time, and also to the students, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, and thank you for the great questions.
Okay. Then I wish bye-bye. Have a nice afternoon, everyone.